Another feature that is widely used in JavaScript is promises. Before we talk about promises, let's take a look on what it tries to solve. Let's say I have a line of code where I want to retrieve some data. So I'm going to call this function getData, which JavaScript will go inside that function, execute whatever code it needs to execute it until it reaches the return statement. Once I get that, it will return the data to this line, and then I can do whatever I need with this code. Just so we give some names to everything, the code on the left is called consuming code because it is expected to consume whatever I'm going to get back from this other function, which is my producing code that will be generating some data or will be retrieving some data for me. This is how JavaScript works. My consuming code will call my producing code and wait until my producing code gets to the final data and returns that back to me. But what if my producing code takes too long to be executed? If that happens, then my application is going to freeze until my producing code is done. It will go inside here, it will wait, it doesn't matter how long it takes, and only the next line will be executed after I get the result from this producing code. This could be an issue because I could have some code that takes 1 or 2 seconds to be executed, which is already some kind of issues, but sometimes it could take 10 or 20 seconds. So how can I solve this? How can I make my application not freeze until I get back this result from the producing code? And this is when we have promises. The idea of a promise is that I will not make my consuming code wait for my producing code. A promise is going to be an object that will link both the producing code and the consuming, and the producing code will be executing whatever it needs to retrieve the data or generate the data, while the consuming code is free to do what else it needs to do. In this case, my promise is going to be an objective that will have the producing code and ways to call back my consuming code. And whenever it calls back, it could call back into different scenarios. One, it was successful. Whatever I needed to produce, whatever result I needed to get, it was successful. So I have a success callback to make to my producing code. However, something could go wrong, something could generate an error. So I would have a second state where I would call an error function where I'm going to show some kind of message. So the way promises work is that I'm going to generate an object which initially is going to have the state of pending. That means my promise was creating, but it is pending the producing code to finish whatever it is doing. Once the producing code finishes, the state is going to be changed to either resolved, if that was successful, or rejected if something went wrong. Whenever I reach one of those states, I need to call back my producing code. And the way I do that is using some methods inside my promise. One method that we use a lot is the method then. Then method will accept a callback function. That callback function will be executed whenever my promise is successfully completed. This callback function will receive one argument, which is the result that we have from this execution. This then method could have a second callback function, which would be the event on rejected. Whenever it fails, I would call back this second function, and with that I would send also one argument, which is an error object, which is the reason of the rejection. However, usually we don't use this second callback function. You can see it is optional, but we don't use. Usually for the then method, we only use the onFulfilled event. That's because I can have the onRejected method inside this other method catch. Inside catch is where I can include also the callback for onRejected, and usually this is how we code with promises. So as an overview, I would create a promise object which will have the producing code, and it would have two callbacks to my consuming code. One callback would be whenever my promise is successfully completed, and the other one would be whenever something goes wrong. If something is successful, I will call back the callback function that I have inside the method then, and if something goes wrong, I will call back the function that I have inside the catch method. So let's take a look how we can work with promises. Let's go back to the code, and although I can create my own promises, most of the time we are just going to be using promises provided by JavaScript or by other libraries that we use inside JavaScript. So let's make one example using the fetch function. The fetch API is something that is provided by JavaScript where I can provide one URL and it's going to fetch the data from that URL. This is the most common scenario where we use promises because whenever I am retrieving data from another website, I never know how long it's going to take. So I should make this kind of call being inside a promise. This way I don't need to wait for the result. Once I have the result, a callback function will be called back. As an example, let's use this website. This type code has this JSON placeholder where it allows me to call this address and get this result back. So let me just copy this URL and let me just include this inside of my code. So whenever I make a fetch, I want to make the fetch to this address. So let's say I want to use this the way we were using before. I want to get back the result from this fetch, and then I want just to console log the result from that. However, it's not going to work because, as you can see, fetch will return a promise. So if I save right now, you can see that the result that I have is that it's going to return a promise. And whenever I got to this third line, the state of my promise was pending. If I click on the arrow here, I will expand this where I'm going to get an updated data for this promise. And as you can see now, the promise state is fulfilled, which means I finished executing everything. But where is the data? I do have a response here, but whenever I got to this line, it was too early for me to have any kind of response because I create the promise and I will not wait for the promise to return a result. I will just continue and execute everything else. So, as mentioned before, the way I work with promises is different. I will not get the result from the promise itself. Instead, I need to go ahead and create the methods, then and catch. I can break these into multiple lines just so we can have a better view of what is going on. So whenever I call this fetch method, this fetch function, I will have the method then and catch being executed. I don't need to log this result, but instead, let's just log a message saying that I am done with the fetch, just so we know once we are over this. And as we have seen, whenever I create the then method, I need to provide a callback function. And for that, let's use an arrow function. And we know we are going to receive back the result. So let's just log the result we get back. And the same for the catch method. I need to provide a callback function which will receive the error from this execution. And let's just log this error object. If I save, you can see that this is what I have right now. First, you can notice that I am logging done before I am logging result, even though if I look inside my line of code, I have this result on line 3 and I have this done on line 6. That's because, again, whenever I create this promise, I will not wait for the result. So I will continue executing whatever code I have, and this code is logging done. After a while, in this case it is really fast, this website, but after a while I get a response. That response could take 1 second, 10 seconds, 1 minute. We never know how long it's going to take, but once I have the result, it is going to be called inside this then method whatever callback function I have here. In this case, I get the result where I get if it was okay, if it worked or not. From here, I could work with the data, but the point here is that we have this idea of promise that will allow me to execute some asynchronous code. If something went wrong, instead of calling this line on line 3, I would call the callback function on line 4. So let's say, instead of calling HTTPS, let's call fake, which doesn't exist. But if I save, you can see that something went wrong. Still, I got executed here the line 6, where it was set as done. And then I got line 4, which is the one where we log the error. So if something goes wrong, I execute the callback function from the catch method, and if that's successful, we execute that function inside the then method. And that's the main idea of a promise, where I can execute some producing code in an asynchronous way. My consuming code don't need to wait until the producing code has finished with the result, because the producing code will call back my consuming code whenever it is done, using the callback functions inside the method then.